Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911 podcast. This is Mitch Ratcliffe. It's good to have you back, folks. Today we're joined by Monica Stephenson, who is the founder and president of idazzle.com, which is a 10-year-old site that's been providing information about how to get the best value and to buy good, honest, and safe diamonds in your jewelry. And she's also a member of the board of directors of Ethical Metalsmiths, which is an organization encouraging ethical mining and sourcing of jewelry materials. And it's through that organization, a mutual friend of ours is also on the board, that I met Monica, and she told me some fascinating stories about what ethical jewelry is aiming to become and what's going on in the mines around the world. So, Monica, welcome to the show. Tell us what's ethical jewelry.
Thank you, Mitch. I really appreciate you taking the time and hearing the story. I would define ethical jewelry as jewelry made with consideration and accommodation to lessen the social and environmental impact of the finished piece of jewelry. Mm-hmm. The pursuit of this idea and the storytelling around various companies and designers and initiatives to help kind of drive this idea is really what led me to be a responsible gemstone dealer and then ultimately to Ethical Metalsmiths as an extension of that. I have been involved in the jewelry industry for over 20 years. Actually, I probably should figure that out exactly. It's probably more like 25 years in all kinds of roles: salesperson at a retail jewelry store, a buyer. I've helped Amazon launch their jewelry store back in 2003. And since 2008, I've been blogging about jewelry on idazzle.com. My kids were little, and it was something I could do on my own schedule at that point. I became increasingly interested in responsible jewelry topics and interviews with people kind of working with artisanal diamonds and gemstones and perhaps, focused on eliminating mercury from gold mining. Right. And I just found myself more and more attracted to those stories. I mean, there's only so many ways and times that you can call something beautiful and sparkly, and I just kind of had reached a point in my career where those stories were much more interesting to me. People doing the right thing for the right reasons, often on the ground, in the ground. So at some point I saw a social media post about a jewelry documentary that was traveling to East Africa. And they were going to trace kind of the journey of a gemstone from the dirt there through to a finished piece of jewelry. Right. So I was fascinated. And a few months later, I found myself, on a plane 9,000 miles away to see where gems truly come from. After writing about them for what felt like a lifetime, it was interesting to actually truly see where they come from and the impact that has. So after I got back, I couldn't stop thinking about how hard the people in Tanzania and Kenya specifically were working, and for not a lot of reward in the global gem market. So I developed a business plan that would help them participate more. I buy rough gems in East Africa directly from miners and dealers there. I import them to the U.S. and have them faceted by individual artisanal cutters here in the U.S., which is actually quite unusual in and of itself. And then some of them are set into designer jewelry capsule collections, and some are just faceted gemstones. And actually, sometimes I even sell the rough gemstones to designers who are working with them in that way. Some of them go into, finished jewelry. Some are just gemstones, but 10% of all purchases fund education and support in the mining communities in East Africa. And that's my way of kind of involving them a little bit more.
So tell us about that education, and maybe a little step back a little bit. And when you say get down in the dirt, you're really talking about people who are literally digging smaller mines, not deep mines, but small pits, and looking for these gemstones. And it's a lifestyle a lot of people have thought of as being ecologically destructive. How do you get involved in changing that behavior? I know that's what drives you. So what was it like when you first walked into one of these locations, and what are their lives like?
So I went to my first mine on that very first film trip, and it was literally, like a life-changing experience for me. It was, as far as holes in the ground goes there, it was sort of medium-sized. It was, you will find a lot of shallow, alluvial mines in certain regions. Other regions, like for Tanzanite, they're very deep rock mining. This is kind of in between. But it was a very daunting trip down into the mine just to get to the entrance of the mine itself, where the tunnel began. So like probably a good 20% grade, almost like having to use your hands and sort of scramble down loose shale, and just to get to the entrance. And then once in, a few feet in, the light is completely gone. So luckily I had a Petzl headlamp. I could switch that on, and you twist and turn and kind of go deeper and deeper. It gets harder and harder to breathe the further in you go. In this case, it was about 450 feet, which is pretty deep. That's probably right about the point where they need to pump in compressed air. Right. So very, and it's like a sweat box. I mean, it's just like humid and it's a rather physically challenging experience to go in. And then once inside the tunnel, when we reached the end of this particular sort of run, they had a little bit of an opening, and they were using like rebar bars and mallets to hammer into the rock and kind of cleave it away, and then sort through and see if they were finding anything. And on that particular day, they actually did find little bits of green. It was a green garnet mine, and it was quite emotional, really, to see that they had actually found something that day, because many days they don't find this. So,
and how many people were working in that small space?
So they had, at that particular mine, there were about 95 workers, several in sort of management and security, but the bulk of those people would be doing what the gentlemen were doing with the rebar and the mallets. And then there's at any given time, they might have 30, 40 people working on again, off again, right? So they're kind of in shifts, basically. And then they fill the dirt and the rock that comes off of the walls and the floor into bags, and then they hand those end over end. So that's part of why you need that kind of manpower, is because it's
just to move it out.
Very, very challenging work, and it's all incredibly manual. We're talking pickaxes, we're talking shovels, and then once out of the mine, then they sort, and then only then would they use a precious tiny bit of water to actually kind of see what they found in terms of any kind of ore. So these are incredibly remote places. So, I mean, I had to fly 9,000 miles just to get to the country. And then once there, we're driving a minimum of probably 3 hours from the closest, nominal village. And, we are deep in the bush, and actually often seeing, animals, and the landscape is spectacular, but it's very primitive, and there's a lot of poverty. So, as you leave those villages and the towns, people are living more and more subsistence. And so it's a little sobering when you actually get to these communities.
Well, so now, and when we use the word ethical mining or ethical jewelry, from a Western perspective, this doesn't sound, just immediately ethical, but the point is that we're starting to improve these folks' lives and behaviors so that they're being more ecologically responsible, as well as being more profitable as a family or a group. How do you give advice about being better stewards of the environment to somebody who has very little water, no electricity, fears for their family's safety and future? You mentioned security as one of the main functions of part of that staff.
Yes.
What gets people to change and to do things that are better for the earth?
So what we have found is that, they will really want to make improvements or make changes, particularly if they can see that, oh, this affects my safety, this affects my family's well-being, this affects my efficiency in finding gems. But to really change that behavior, I mean, some of it's very ingrained, and they've been doing things the same way for a number of years, and so they have to do it as economically feasible as possible, right? They can't. Right. There's no geologists to be had, even if they could pay them thousands of, the equivalent of US dollars. It just doesn't exist. It's very, very few resources. So, through NGOs who do a lot of great stuff on the ground, but also people like myself who visit the mines and actually go meet with them, talk to them, shake their hands, sit down for tea, and actually get to know, what do you need? And asking them, truly, what is it that you need in your lives or your family's lives? Typically, anything involving education for their children ranks very, very highly for them.
So they're looking for a better future.
They're looking for exactly the same things we're looking for. And once you can point to maybe some you have to start very simply, very basic. These are the 6 things that it would be great if you were doing at this mine. Fill your holes, reinforce your shafts. I'm not a geologist nor a mine engineer, so I can't advise on those particular things, but we can have conversations about what they need from a personal level. Right. Things that, I know that NGOs have been very, very successful working with things like eliminating child labor, for instance, at not so much at the mines that I go to. The places that I'm traveling, gemstones are not as hyper valuable as, say, diamonds or precious metals. So you have a lot more room for abuse for those things. And those typically are found in like Sierra Leone or the DRC. Where I'm going, it's pretty rocks, but they are not like life or death valuable. And so, you don't find the same kind of human rights abuses as you might in some other areas. So, but, NGOs have told me, you know what, we will sit down and we'll educate people. You really don't want your children in the mine. You really need to send them to X village, to school. They'll post signs, they'll come back, they'll do spot checks. People respond very, very favorably when they're given alternatives and given the education just to know that there's another alternative out there. Of course, it helps if there was like a mobile school that was started, or, a more accessible school, or someone to pay perhaps uniform and book fees, for those children to go to school instead of work. So you have to give some economic incentive, you have to give some safety incentive, but typically if people know that there's an alternative, they will embrace that wholeheartedly.
So, the obvious example of remediating a mining process for the environment is the use of mercury in gold mining to separate the ore from the rest of the material. And that's something a lot of people know about. In gemstone mining, what kind of changes in their ecological behavior have you seen as a result of your visits and the NGO's activities?
I've been making these trips for about 3 years now. I've made, I think, 8 or 9 more trips since that first trip with the film. So it's not like I have a huge, length of time that I can kind of go back and measure. But I would say that I have been pleasantly surprised when some mining communities, they have, of their own accord, taken the old tailings, which is just really discarded rock that's been sort of sifted, and it's mostly just gravel, and they'll go ahead and fill their holes so that animals or people can't fall in them, or that there's not the runoff issues. And sometimes they'll actually plant crops where those prospecting holes or mine holes were. So that's actually a really interesting thing. And also seeing entire kind of sustainable communities evolve around some of these mining sites because, like I said, they're very remote. But what will end up happening is suddenly there are goats and chickens, and now there's milk and there's eggs, and they can trade those things, and they can kind of build maybe eventually you have enough concentration of people that now there's a school, now there's a little medical clinic. So mining isn't always necessarily a bad thing. It provides valuable employment. It's not a particularly, I mean, it's dangerous, but, farming can also be rather difficult and dangerous, and life is sort of difficult and dangerous with no infrastructure there. So mining becomes, if done well, if done right, it can actually be an actual, decent employment.
And then the other thing that it seems like this is an opportunity to change is site choice. A lot of mines have been put into areas that are protected sanctuaries and otherwise. Once the miners learn that they have the opportunity to tap into better services, to do better with their own resources and be safer, do they also start to think about protecting a forest and not tearing it down in order to get to the mining space? How does that change their behavior with regard to choosing where they're going to mine?
So much like any other education, I think most of them will respond very favorably that this is an ecologically protected area. You're not supposed to. I know that there are beautiful garnets there, but there's also garnets located 30 kilometers on the other side of this border. Maybe you shouldn't mine there. Again, some people will respond to that, but also a little bit of that is we have seen a little bit more government oversight, particularly in Tanzania, where they are actually sort of restricting access, and there are consequences to that. And of course, that's effective. But I think when we start to take care of people's hierarchy of needs, the environment ranks rather low for miners and people in these gemstone communities because they're trying to survive. Water is
they're at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy.
Exactly. And so when you start to take care of more and more of their basic needs, if they could start to see a decent income, if we can come in every 6 months and pay fair trade prices, which puts money into the community and into their pockets, and ask them what they need and help, provide a percentage back to them in terms of, and have the community decide what it is that they want to do with that money, then it's similar to Fair Mine Gold model, where that premium, there's a premium on the spot price of gold, but that goes back into the community and they get to choose what they get to do with it. And I think that that's really the way to start to see kind of, they have to have a sustainable business. It can't be charity alone. It has to be something that they have skin in the game, they invest in as well. If they are working hard and finding beautiful gemstones, we can help find a market for those gemstones. And consequently, if we can get a decent price for those, then we can also help them in their lives and in their community. And the standard of living, hopefully, will continue to go up. Again, it's pretty new, and we're trying to focus specifically on a few areas so that we can start to see that kind of impact versus scattershot over many countries or many communities. We're not going to see as much of that sort of economic gain. So one step at a time, sometimes it feels like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. But if we can help people get to a level of security in their basic lifestyle, then the environment and those considerations become something that they care about as well.
So that takes us back to the American consumer and their ability to make decisions that support this kind of fair trade, ethical approach to mining. Are there any laws that require transparency in the provenance of metal or gems in the United States right now? And how can a consumer recognize what is ethical?
So there is the Dodd-Frank legislation that was passed in 2010, which required larger jewelry companies and other industries who use gold specifically from the DRC to be able to trace and track exactly where that gold was coming from, back to the refiner and then even to the mine. And at first people said, that's impossible, it's never going to happen, it can't happen. But as legislation can sometimes prove, when there's a will, there's a way. And that actually has kind of come to pass, where there is actually pretty good accountability of gold coming from that particular region. But
what about other regions?
Not all gold comes from the DRC. That's exactly what I was going to kind of point out. There's gold that comes from many different areas. All of them have their own logistical and potentially political issues. And so, and many of those locations use mercury, which is a huge issue. And there are initiatives, there are some other, plans in the works to try to eliminate mercury, for instance, or to, put that kind of transparency to other supplies, other things like gemstones and diamonds. But honestly, we are a ways from that being a true universal reality. There's blockchain, which is a number of different companies have sort of initiated their own programs. De Beers has a blockchain. Richline has their own trust chain. Everledger is someone involved in the jewelry industry, but also other industries. And I think it's a very interesting application, having like an actual tracking system and certifications and things that would allow consumers incredible transparency into the supply chain. But until we have those things really widely in place, what I would recommend is there's a lot of questions that need to be asked. So if consumers can ask their jeweler, their retailer, where is this from? Do you know where the metal comes from? Who's your refiner?
An active, conscious consumer. You have to
exactly.
Yep.
And it starts with the consumer, because if the consumer asks those questions, then the retailer has to turn around and find out the answers to those questions. And many of them, at this point may not know all of their materials, all of their supply chains. If they carry 5 different designers, 10 different designers, they have to go back to those manufacturers, those designers, and find out, where does your gold come from? But by asking at every level, we start to kind of claw back. We start to go back to the origin and the source and find out truly where those materials are from. And we're a ways from that really being accessible to consumers, but it's an important part of the process. And I think more and more people, people want to know where their tomato comes from. People want to know where their skirt is made. Of course, they're going to want to know, where did the materials come from that is a piece of jewelry, is part of your body. It becomes part of you. It is also commemorates often a special occasion or some important milestone. You want to know that actually has a positive impact versus a negative impact.
Yeah, it's a terrible thing to say my engagement ring was made by slave labor and people died. It's not the kind of thing
that would be the worst case scenario, and it is. And I don't know how likely that is, but it is certainly at some point in the history of diamonds and precious metals. There are stories like that. So we need to do better. We need to be more accountable, both as an industry, but also as consumers.
Well, you also told me about the Responsible Jewelry Council, and this seems to be sort of an informal movement at this point. But the jewelry industry overall, does appear to be focusing on its sustainability through that organization. How do you see that becoming a more formal part of the system? Because, for instance, they could run the blockchain that provided the provenance of all the materials in the long term, for instance. I completely agree with you that because of the Internet of Things and all the sensors and all the other kinds of communication that are going to be available to us over the next decade with something called 5G, that we will be able to track virtually anything from its source to the consumer. Is the Responsible Jewelry Council the way to do that?
Well, so the Responsible Jewelry Council is an organization based in London that is, they are a certification agency, and they actually will audit, in addition to self-assessments, they will actually take the step of auditing people who are making companies, individuals who are making claims about the origin of their materials or their practices. They will actually audit those, and you can achieve a certain level of certification with them. However, they only do that for precious metals and for diamonds, I believe. Definitely not for gemstones. So there is no overarching certification system for gemstones, which has made it because of its artisanal nature, it's incredibly fragmented. There's not the same level of large scale mining that you have for diamonds. So it's 80% of gemstones come from artisanal sources. So I would say that many constituents in the jewelry industry are at least interested in how they can be more sustainable and responsible. So they're asking questions, they're curious. There's a number of different ways to kind of pursue that, and RJC would be one of them, but they're working on making their system a little bit more accessible, I think, to smaller entities. But if you're a smaller designer, RJC certification would be pretty onerous at this point. So, so there are things like, there's a number of different initiatives. There's the Jewelry Industry Summit, which is a gathering of all of these varied constituents, from the tiniest studio jeweler to the largest companies. And there was a summit held in 2016, trying to get everybody in a room and decide on harmonization of codes and what are we talking about and how are we defining these things. We had to take a step back to kind of build the framework to be able to talk about this in such a fragmented industry. So that's one thing, and a number of initiatives have come out of the Jewelry Industry Summit. There's the Mercury-Free Mining Challenge that's run by the wonderful Toby Pomeroy, who's been a champion for clean gold, eliminating mercury from the gold supply for decades. And then there's Ethical Metalsmiths, where our kind of mutual connection, where it is a gathering place. It's a community of caring jewelers who can kind of connect with each other, educate each other, but also reach out to the consumer and kind of connect to the consumer as well. So there's ways for the industry to kind of, wherever they are on their journey, because it is a journey. It is not actually, we're not talking about achieving perfection and a checklist immediately. This is something that's going to take time. It's everybody comes to it from a different perspective, but the importance is that people, I feel that there's more of a movement now, and there's a little bit more momentum towards asking these questions and finding answers that we can all live with.
Well, Monica, this is fascinating, and it's great to see the progress. A lot of people want to see perfection, but you can't get to perfection without the conversations that we're talking about you having right now.
Exactly.
It's great. People can follow you at idazzle.com. Do you write about this anywhere else?
You can also follow my adventures as I call myself the accidental gemstone dealer, because it definitely was a twist to my career a few years ago. But Anza Gems is the name of my responsible gemstone company, and you can find both iDazzle and Anza Gems on Instagram, as well as online. So I talk a lot about the journey, not just pretty gems, which is always fascinating, but also all of these other challenges as well. So
Well, thank you, Monica, very much for sharing the story with us today of ethical metalsmiths and ethical jewelry. Folks, this is Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911 podcast. We'll be back next time with another interview and more conversation. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you soon.